Hello, everyone. Welcome to Fortune Society's show, Both Sides of the Bars. Thank you for joining us. We really appreciate it. So today I have really fantastic guest. Her name is Dr. Ashley Nellis, and we're going to be talking about mandatory minimum. So we read a little bit of information here. The title of this show is How Mandatory Minimums Perpetuate Mass Incarceration and What to Do About It. And Ashley is an expert in this particular area, so we're really excited to have this conversation. So, I just want to share a little bit of information before we get started. So, there is widespread evidence that mandatory minimum sentences produce substantial harm with no overall benefit to crime control, according to a report by the Sentencing Project, which is where Dr. Ashley Nellis works. She's a co director of research there. Mandatory minimums are legal provisions in each state and the federal government that require a specific minimum prison term for certain crimes, regardless of individual circumstances. Determined by lawmakers rather than judges, these sentences represent a uniquely American approach to sentencing that has accelerated prison growth. Now, we all know that over the last few decades, really since the 1970s, our prison population has really grown exponentially, right? And people are remaining in prison for longer. We have a really expansive aging population. So this is really good time for us to have a conversation about mandatory minimums and what we think should be done about them. So I want to welcome our guest, Dr. Ashley Nellis, to this particular conversation and start. Ashley, how you doing today?
I'm good. How are you? Thanks for
Doing pretty
having me.
well. It's our pleasure. So should I call you Ashley or Dr. Nellis? Which one do you prefer?
Ashley's great.
Ashley's great. Okay, so thank you, Ashley. So again, mandatory minimums is the topic of today. This is something that you have specific expertise in. Can you give the our audience just some context about mandatory minimum sentences? Like what does that even mean? I've read a little blurb, but I think you can give the audience a lot more context about what mandatory minimums actually are.
Sure. So the sentencing project's work actually began in response to concerns around the loss of discretion that comes with mandatory minimums. And our corrections and our judicial system has, over the course of its existence, gone back and forth about whether and to what extent decision makers should have discretion in deciding the amount of punishment people should receive. And in the 1970s, and then accelerating into the 80s, and especially up until the peak of mass incarceration, states and federal government adopted the view that judges are not in the best position for one reason or another to use discretion on individual sentences, and that instead statutes, so legislators, should make those decisions about how long of a punishment somebody needs. So that is the system that we live in the US at this point, where really it's legislators, elected officials decide how long a person should stay in prison as a response to the crime that they were convicted of. And what that has caused is a real upswing in the prison population, so that we're now, just slightly coming back from, a peak that was in the 2009, 2010 years, where prison populations reached an all-time high.
Excellent. Thank you for that information. And for people who are not as informed about this issue, if you look at any graph, as you pointed out, you just see incarceration rates going up uh, very significantly from the 1970s, when we had maybe a couple of 100,000 people incarcerated in our system, to we reached like over 2 million people, and we're considered the largest jailer. How much of a role do you believe that mandatory minimum sentences are playing in the reality that we're currently in, where we have so many people, like our systems are like bursting at the seam?
I think they've played a large role. You can see this by looking at the people convicted of drug offenses, especially in the federal system, where most people don't know that about half of the people who are in federal prison, which you would generally think to be the most serious, are there for a drug offense. And this is a direct result of mandatory minimums that were passed in the 80s, and then strengthened after that, some of which have been rolled back a little bit. So the most famous is the crack disparity, crack sentences being disparate from powder cocaine sentences, but having an enormous impact on the incarcerated population at the federal level, especially people who were Black being convicted for crack offenses. And the laws around this were created to be mandatory. So you have to serve all of your time, or in some instances, 85% of the time, in certain states. And this would, it added more and more people to the prison numbers without having that release mechanism on the back end.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, you think about the point that you're making here. You want to allow for prisons to rehabilitate people, and then for them to likely be able to get out when it's when they presented a strong case for them to be able to do so, whether it's through education and other things that individuals have been able to do while they were inside. Now, these mandatory minimum sentences, Ashley, I know that there's been some advocacy. Groups like Mothers Against Mandatory Minimums have formed, and they're one group that has been around for a long time. Is there the type of advocacy that is needed, that, in your view, to really scale back some of the mandatory minimum laws that are like responsible for our prison population, as we are suggesting here, being as large as it is?
I think that the sort of the illogical arguments around mandatory minimums are starting to really take root in general understanding of why we have so many people in prison. I think that has been popularized by think films like 13th and Mercy and other criminal justice related films that end up in pop culture, or Orange is the New Black is another large one. And so that's terrific. We want to educate the public about this because, people in prison are by definition kept away from, public view. And so you can, as a legislator or as a corrections administrator, really get away with a lot because it's a population that is outside of general public view. So when there is sort of a highlighting of how unfair and illogical and inefficient mandatory minimums are, that is terrific. I think that there's a big disconnect, though, between popular understanding about mandatory minimums and then really forcing legislators to do something about it through voter behavior and really dismantling the media rhetoric that has been made around this whole sort of tough on crime narrative. And I think we have a ways to go on that. And I think, that the recent uptick in crime that happened largely as a result of COVID, that is now, seeing a turnaround, could have the potential to have longer effects in terms of getting public support back on tough on crime legislation. And that is generally, where the mandatory minimums start to take root again.
Gotcha. Yeah. I mean, that is always a concern, especially when we are in times, the political times, where we are voting for candidates for governor, voting for candidates for mayor and president. You often see a ratcheting up of the rhetoric, especially if there have been some concerns about crime. I mean, we know that crime has been going down now for decades, but of course, periodically you have a situation where crime, like I'm in New York City, crime. We talk about crime in the subway. We talk about crime in different areas, and I think at times there's like these moral panics that happen around crime, so that the larger community focuses on those things, because when you turn on the news, you automatically see crimes, but the general public is not looking at a report. They're not looking at statistics. They're not saying, oh yeah, crime is going down. They're going based upon what they feel and what they see. So what are your thoughts about what needs to be done to kind of like change the perception that the community often feels about crime, and how that might be different from what the actual reality is?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's something that, we grapple with. One of the ways that we try to make an impact here is by really holding the media to account for where it's getting its information and how it's, putting it out. So we have a few different reports and publications and such, and that try to not educate the public so much as educate the media about these are the ways that, when you report on this issue, crime issue, there's some just general rules you may want to follow. Like, are you following only the, sort of the, if it bleeds, it leads tactic? Are you giving a representative a perspective? Are you identifying people who are suspects in a different way if they're Black than if they're white? And that is something that you can see sort of empirically a lot, where there's a lot more harmful words around people who are suspects in crimes when they're Black. And we saw this, really take a serious turn in the super predator era, right? Referring to people as if they were predators, right? And those people were Black. And so, when the media doesn't do its job to completely sever those ideas, then it is failing, to provide really fact based reporting. So, the first thing that, I think we could do is to improve our standards, for the media, but also, individually, where are we willing to get our news? Because if we're only willing to get our news from the easiest place, social media, we're likely to develop a biased view. But if we're willing to go a little bit further into something that is more objective and less flashy, then we will get the real story. So that's part of it. And then there's also, educating the public about, it's not important just to vote, let's say, for the president or for your US senator. It's also very important to figure out who is running for the prosecutor's office and the sheriff's office, because these people make crime policy, either directly or indirectly, or they implement it in their own way. And that has implications for who ends up prosecuted, who ends up convicted, and who ends up imprisoned.
That's excellent. Thank you so much. I like the idea of educating the media and also educating the public, because you need the media to understand the context and the nuance that's associated with what happens with crime policy and crime, and of course the public, because the public are the ones that are feeling like the community is not safe. And if they feel like the community is not safe, then they might actually be pushing for mandatory minimum sentences, even if evidence demonstrates that mandatory minimum sentences are not effective at doing what politicians think that they will do. I'm here, as I said, I'm here in New York, and I recall the Rockefeller drug laws, and those were consistent, what you said on the federal level, how the disparity was just, crack cocaine versus powder cocaine. And I saw so many people, as someone who's formerly incarcerated, I saw a lot of people go into the system with drug charges and receive very, very stiff penalties because of mandatory minimum sentences. And I know people did 15 and did 20 years. And you ask yourself, is that what the public would want? That someone who, sold a certain amount of drugs or what have you, and ended up getting 15 years, is that really the penalty that the public wants? And then the cost associated with leaving someone or having someone serve that stiffer penalty, and then you go back and you say, was it really worth it from a human standpoint, from a standpoint of us saying we believe in second chances, and from a situation where we want people to be able to thrive after they've been impacted by the system. So one issue here is, Ashley, is, you mentioned this earlier, is giving judges discretion, because the laws as they stand, the mandatory minimums, are really the legislature decides what the sentence is. Why should we move to a situation where judges have more discretion, and then that is the system that we think could actually work more effectively?
Um, there's a lot you said there. I think that judges are certainly in a better place than prosecutors to make impartial decisions. They have been trained for that work, and they are, their job is to be a neutral arbiter. Prosecutors have, the goal of winning a case. They are often elected, not always, but so they also have a political motivation at times, and that isn't to, completely disregard the value of a prosecutor, but to put so much power of the length of a sentence into the hands of a prosecutor is misguided and cruel, really. And so I think that, judges are in a better place to do that. When we see things like the Rockefeller drug laws, you make some really, really important points. And an additional point is to ask, did it meet a public safety benefit to put so many people convicted of drug offenses into prison for 15 years or more? And, I think the obvious answer is no. I think that when we have a system that people generally feel is unfair, and they feel is not going to get it right, in terms of identifying the right conviction, certainly, and then the right punishment, you see more, sort of rejection of that system. And you don't want that, right, in a democracy in America. You want people to believe that the judicial system, that the criminal legal system is functioning, and that it's fair, and that it's precise. But I don't think many Americans feel that. And that is because it is so, it leans so far to the sort of political whims here and there. and always has had a sort of underbelly of racism that guides it. And that is, the main part of the work that we're doing at the Sentencing Project to try to, dismantle that. And in the end, to have a system that is functional, which is, we have a ways to go.
Excellent. Thank you for that. We do know that, again, if we're talking about protecting public safety, that we need to have certain tools at our disposal, right? Including prevention and early intervention. So we have like alternatives to incarceration programs. We know that if you invest in those programs, you get some better outcomes, fewer individuals going into the system, and of course, then fewer getting these lengthy jail and prison terms. What are some ideas around prevention and or early intervention that the Sentencing Project would have our audience know about?
So some of the things that we work on in terms of alternatives are, one of the big points, the big takeaways that I think is necessary here is that, yes, certain people need to change their behavior. And the people who are breaking the law need to, stop breaking the law, whatever they're doing. We also need to change the structure, the social structure that is, one of the problems that sort of perpetuates mass incarceration. And by that, I mean, we have such an income disparity in the US. We have people who are so poor. I mean, we're seeing it this week with the Supreme Court case, considering what to do with the homeless. And yet we're, an extremely rich country, and we have to, spend our time figuring out how, to respond to the homeless when it should be obvious, that they need homes. And there's also, this racism that really permeates our legal system. And there's a structure of policing that is many times far too militaristic and, too infrequently public service oriented. So these structures really are part of why we have and why we continue to have mass incarceration. When you let somebody out of prison and they have to face these structures once again, and they're coming out with a conviction. I mean, a record. It's almost impossible for many people, and so we want to make it so that it's possible and likely that they will succeed when they come out. So in order to prevent and to provide alternatives, one of the things we need to do is to really shift those structures. I think, also raising the felony threshold has done a lot. I think ending cash bail has done a lot. And I think that, really shortening these criminal sentences and eliminating mandatory minimums, responding to both the back end by allowing people a second look, but also the front end by reversing some of these draconian mandatory laws, will go a far way to ending mass incarceration and recalibrating the entire system so that it's one that's, truly able to be functional.
Excellent. And I so appreciate that you brought up the Supreme Court case. I believe it's Grants Pass versus Johnson, where the Supreme Court just heard arguments the other day about whether or not the town Grants Pass in Oregon should be ticketing people who are homeless or unhoused in a place where they don't have a shelter for these individuals. So yeah, I mean, it's just, thank you for raising that. And I also appreciate what you said about, people who are involved in the system. Like, there is accountability. We're a Fortune Society, we're a public safety organization. We consider ourselves that, in that the people that we work with, we want them to be able to be successful. We want our communities to be safe. although we're providing services to people who are incarcerated, people who are coming home from prison, etc., we're still a public safety. And so, yeah, as we get close to the end of the show, any final thoughts about this particular topic mandatory minimums, and any like recommendations or information you'd like to share with the public?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much again for having me. There are always legislative opportunities for people in New York and the federal system, and from wherever people are watching, to see what sort of statutes are being considered, either that add mandatories or that pull them back to something more reasonable or eliminate them altogether. So the first, the main recommendation is to get involved, look at your legislator and what they're up to, particularly if they're on any sort of judiciary committee, and reach out to the Fortune Society for more information, I'm sure.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you for the plug for Fortune. I like the idea of getting involved. We always encourage people, no matter what jurisdiction you're in, because Fortune, although our services are here, the impact of our policy work is felt nationally, and we want more people to get involved. Our show is now, syndicated in different states, so we definitely appreciate that. Another point I think you were talking about is like look back provisions. I mean, people are in there with mandatory minimum sentences, and then like what's happening with those individuals. We're pushing for an opportunity for the legislature, judges, et cetera, to actually look back on those convictions and determine if individuals should stay in prison with the sentences that they received. So thank you, Dr. Ashley Nellis, for this really for this exciting conversation, and how you've elaborated on these valuable points regarding mandatory minimums. And look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.